Hi everybody, welcome back to the 11th episode of Open Source for Business, brought to you by Open Teams. I hope that you all had a great holiday period and trust that you're getting back into the swing of things at work for what I hope is a great 2021 for all of you. In this episode of Open Source for Business, I talked with Matt Yonkovit, who is the Chief Experience Officer at Percona. Percona is a service provider for open source databases like MariaDB, MySQL, and PostgreSQL. For over 10 years, Matt worked as a database architect before transitioning into consulting roles at both MySQL and Sun Microsystems. He's got over 25 years of experience in both open source and databases, so needless to say, the lessons that I learned in this podcast were invaluable to me, and I'm sure they'll be invaluable to you too. As I mentioned before, this podcast is brought to you by Open Teams, the first open source services marketplace where users of open source software can find, vet, and contract with service providers. So now that we're ready, let's cue the music. I thought I'd kick it off by just talking about, so you're currently the Chief Experience Officer at Percona, and Percona offers, in short, just open source database solutions. We'll dive a bit more into that in a little bit, but at the moment, you're currently focused on the client and customers. But I know when researching for this podcast, I learned that you were actually a techie for a large part of your career. I think for the better part of 10 years or over 10 years, you were a database architect. So can you walk us through that evolution to give us an idea of how you got here today?
Sure, no problem. I mean, this starts way back when I was in college, actually, and I worked for an internet service provider. And when I started, I started in tech support, right? So back in the days of dial-up modems, when you got that squeal every time you dialed, we were one of the competitors to AOL, just a small kind of mom and pop place. And after working there for about a year, the VP of engineering came over and he says, you've been here a year, you're doing a good job. What do you want your career to be? I'm like, I don't know. I'm still in college. It's like, well, go back and think about it. So back then, before there were job boards, I went and I looked in the newspaper, actually, because, job boards were fairly new. And I found that, hey, Oracle DBAs pay pretty well compared to like programmers. So I'm like, I think I want to be a DBA. And I didn't know what a DBA was. Yeah, I didn't know what a DBA was, but it looked like it paid a lot. There were a lot of jobs for it. So, He goes, I think we need that. And so, you can be it. And that's how my career as a database admin started. But from there, I actually continued that with several larger companies. So Penske Logistics, GE-owned company. I worked for insurance companies. I worked for Fortune 500 companies. So a little bit of here and there. And I always worked on the, Oracle, SQL Server, DB2 space, all these different database technologies. But then I started to get hooked on open source. And so it really was interesting. I started doing some development on my own, starting to deploy MySQL, Postgres, try some different things. And I saw an ad for a company looking for a consultant. And that company happened to be MySQL AB. Right. So back in the day, and I'm like, hey, I use them in my own, website, the own company that I was running. And I'm like, that sounds kind of cool. And so I got a job working for MySQL AB as a consultant. And my job was to parachute into God knows where. So it was all over the country, all over the world, to help people not only get the most out of MySQL, but also get the most out of open source. We kind of went up and down the stack a little bit, playing around with Apache, PHP, some Perl, some Ruby, a little bit of everything to try and get people to adopt open source more. And for about a couple of years, my address was the Hilton. Because I traveled all over the world.
Very nice. Pretty hard to complain.
For me, it was kind of cool. For my wife, she didn't really care for it that much. But, so it tends to, be one of those things. But I learned so much. And I used to be an introvert. I used to not, like to talk to people. Back in the early days, I was more of the guy who, let me have my database, let me sit in the corner, let me tune some queries, let me do some of these things. But when I started to go from client to client and do some really cool things, we started to find out that, you had to change your mentality. You had to flip who you were, because every week you're introduced to someone new and they have a new problem and you need to establish a rapport and credibility. So it really had to kind of flip my mindset. And I found that I was really good at connecting with people and telling people, kind of the background and the story of why this mattered, what we were doing, how it would work. And from there, I continued to grow. And shortly before MySQL got acquired, Sun got acquired by Oracle, after the Sun acquisition, the founder of Percona, Peter Zaitsev, and I started talking about moving over there. And he had come from MySQL as well, so we had known each other and moved over there to basically do the same thing, drop in from customer to customer to customer. So I started to learn all about what customers need and want in this open source space, in this database space. And it was this really, really cool, background, and it was really engaging. But I found that I could talk to customers. Customers kept on asking for me personally, and they wanted more of what I could do. And so that grew into a role where I took, responsibility for managing the team. So the team of, consultants that, was at Percona, I managed the Americas team. So out of Americas, then the global team. Then eventually we added support and managed service. And so, as time went on, we found more activities that our customers needed, they wanted, more ways to help them be successful. And, I was able to make that connection with how they wanted to be, shown, these products, how they needed to be helped, what sort of things worked, what sort of things didn't. And that continued to snowball until eventually I was, in charge of global services, then customer success and the chief customer officer for a while. And now chief experience officer, kind of looking to see what we can do for that customer experience side that we did after the sale happened, and run it all the way through community and all the way through the process before someone buys, before they even know that you exist. How do we bring that awesome customer knowledge experience throughout the entire organization and the entire customer journey? And so it's been a really exciting eclectic ride. It's have a lot of pivots and a lot of back and forths, but it was very exciting.
That is very exciting. I remember you first mentioned the other day that you used to be an introvert, and I was shocked. I thought, how? It doesn't make sense. But I guess you must have trained and just gotten over that need. Like, how was that? And did you find that you were not the only person in open source that is an introvert? Because I know that it seems like there's quite a few introverts in the open source space.
Well, it's funny that they fall into a couple of categories, right? So a lot of contributors end up being introverts, right? So you have a lot of, people who develop some awesome code, but, talking publicly, unless it's technical, okay? If they can talk technical all day long, right? And, unless it's technical, then, they have difficult time because it's something that they're not comfortable with. They want to talk tech to tech. We used to have a consultant who, was a brilliant guy. And, we would go out, when we had group get-togethers, all the consultants would come in and, we would go and, you'd drink beer and you would, eat pizza, you'd do whatever event that you had, you try and decompress, and you'd be talking about something. You'd turn to him and say like, oh, how's it going? And he would immediately jump right into memory tuning variables and kernel debugging parameters and everything else.
Yep.
And you're like, great. And then you go back and you'd be talking about what your kids are going to do, what your wife is doing this weekend, your hobbies, whatever. You go back to him and more kernel tuning, right? And that's cool because there's those people who thrive on that as well. But you do see a lot of extroverts as well, because when you look at the community that open source has brought up, there's a lot of passion, and there's a lot of people who love open source so much and they love to share it. And that's what's so exciting about the open source community and the open source spaces is you get the people who are really comfortable talking tech and they love to share that tech, but you also get the people who are very passionate about open source and they love to preach, evangelize, and tell people about how awesome it is.
And so was that passion always there? Is that a recent thing in the last decade, or what did you witness over your time as it sort of evolved?
Well, I think it's always been there, but it's been a smaller community early on, right? And so now you're seeing more widespread acceptance. And, it's funny, back when I started MySQL AB, my first day, I came from the enterprise, right? So I'm all stuffy, I know what to do in the background. And my first day there, Martin Mikos had decided before I arrived to move the company towards an open core model. So, and as you know, open core, has some, big, proponents and some big opponents, right? The open core debate has raged on for a very, very long time. But during that movement for MySQL, there was a all company email thread where Martin Mikos was called the devil, and people were like, you're going to burn in hell for this. And all kinds of just crazy stuff. And I go to my wife, oh my God, I can't believe this. Someone's going to get fired the first day here. Somebody's going to get fired because look at all this, this debate, look at all this anger, and no one got fired. And I'm like, what? And then I remember my boss telling me, well, no, we appreciate the debate. Everyone has a voice. Everyone, we want to hear that, the opposition. We want to understand it. We want to embrace it. Just because you take a passionate stance doesn't necessarily mean that you're right or wrong, but you do have that capability. And that's something that's always stuck with me, is that, awesome, openness, and that awesome willingness to debate and to stand on your principles. Even if you are in passionate disagreement, right? You're still going to be able to, at the end of the day, see eye to eye because you both respect one another, in each other's view. That's just an awesome place to be.
Well, no, I love that response. And I think definitely just the idea of a passion driving this thing is led to where it is today. Most companies now using open source. Everyone's at least heard about it or has a little bit of an idea about it. And I think it's hopefully that continues. Hopefully that grows. Do you think that's something that's going to continue into perpetuity? Or
well, absolutely. I mean, it continues to grow, but it's evolving into some weird spaces, right? Because now we've got what is open source and what is not open source. And so there are a lot of products now who are evolving to a not necessarily open source community driven model. Right. And it's a little bit of a wolf in sheep's clothing when you think about it, because we're open source compatible, which means we're compatible with other open source products, or kind of open source like, but not really open source. So how do you handle those? And when you start to look at, there's been a massive amount of debate on cloud providers and what they've done with open source. And a lot of them have enhanced open source to the point where it's no longer open. And so you've got that as well. You've got, companies like MongoDB who have come out and said, we've never really developed MongoDB as open source to accept contributions. We've developed it as a freemium model, as a business model, right? So you've got these different intentions from different companies. And sometimes that hurts the innovation. It hurts the passion of some of those communities. Other times you still have the passionate communities. It's just they're not at the technical depth that some of the other communities are. Postgres, for instance, has an insanely awesome community of very passionate, deeply technical people who understand the internals of Postgres. MongoDB's community is very developer-friendly and very focused on developers. They don't necessarily know the ins and outs of the underlying source code. So you get these different groups that kind of pop up. But as the new generation is starting to adopt open source software, how they're adopting it isn't the same way. And so there is a little risk that, some of the contributors and the contributions and what that initial kind of round brought to us might not be the same in the second round, because you might not have access to the source code for the product that you use. You might be using, a cloud provider's version of MySQL or Postgres, or a MongoDB compatible version. And, so you click it up, you spin it, it's up and running. And now all of a sudden you don't have access to the source code to take a look, to innovate, to find out how these things work. And so that's going to be a challenge for a lot of folks.
And what are some of the impacts that you think that's going to have on the open source software industry? And is that something, I guess we'll start with that question. And the second question, is that something that's coming in, we'll see the negative impacts in the next 5 years, 10 years? When do you think?
Well, I mean, I think that, is it going to have a negative impact? No, more people are going to adopt it, right? And that's good. The bigger the open source pie, the better for all of us, right? Because we want to make the pie bigger. We want more open source adoption. The challenge that I think you're going to run into is we're in a generation where we're developing a group of people who don't necessarily have the same knowledge of the internal workings or how, the open source software that they're running actually works. And we keep on getting, magnitudes of degree away from that back end, especially as you start to see, X as a service solutions start to pop up, right? Mm-hmm. So instead of having to spin up your own WordPress or, your own Joomla or, Magento instances. You go to the one click now and you spin it up. So you don't have to know it, which is great for speed, right? Mm-hmm. But you lose some of the capabilities, the background to understand how it works and why it's doing certain things. Mm-hmm. And that's very limiting. And so you're going to see a need for expertise continue to rise, and there's going to be a shortfall because honestly, while a lot of the software and a lot of the tooling that we've seen developed over the last few years through the X as a service, through Kubernetes, through the one-click deployments, they're awesome in bringing databases and development tools to the masses. They hide that complexity, and a lot of people know how to click the button. They know how to spin up additional instances. They know how to move to the next instance size and increase the spend. They don't necessarily know how to get the most out of what they're already using. And that's where I like to say you need kind of this RoboCop approach, half human, half cyborg, right? Or half robot. It's the cyborg approach. You're going to need someone who knows what they're doing, at some point. And that's where there's a lot of room for growth for those who are really interested in the open source space to become an open source expert, to understand the internal workings and help evangelize people who might be used to that one click, the one button solution, and how these actually work, and help them get the most out of those solutions as well.
Okay, and what capacity do you think that person comes in as? Are they an open source expert, or are you looking to hire internally to deal with this problem, or do you go outside and look for, say, service providers to help out? What is the solution to this problem?
Well, it's most larger companies, and it depends on the company size. Okay, and so what we found, and we've surveyed the industry, quite extensively on this, but what we found is, most companies will start looking for their own internal hires. They'll try and bring on hires. It's not easy, especially in the database space, right? Database is kind of a boring technology, if you will. It's not terribly exciting for a lot of developers. It's kind of like, oh, you're a database administrator. Oh, we don't talk to you guys. We're on the edgy stuff, right? And so when you talk about database stuff, it's really hard to find good qualified open source DBAs, and a lot of technology has made it so you don't have to. So a lot of companies will first look to elevate their existing staff into those open source roles, and so they'll take developers who might be good at SQL Server, or might be good at .NET, or whatever, and they'll try and turn them into open source people, which sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. I think a lot of times folks find that the features or the polish or the enterprise focus of some of these things is missed because a lot of these developers or DBAs have been in this space for so long, working with Oracle or SQL Server or DB2, that it's really hard to make that transition. And so you'll start there. But then when you can't find them, then you'll slowly try and build out teams. You'll try and compete, but you're competing with some really big companies. In the smaller, more agile companies have really interesting use cases, and everybody wants to work for those Silicon Valley unicorns, right? If your choice is working for Big Bank USA or working for Facebook or Twitter, you're probably going to go Facebook or Twitter, if those are your choices, right? And so you see that talent gap there, and so you end up trying to hire and to build the expertise. But in a lot of cases, you're going to end up augmenting that with services, with tooling. And so we're seeing a rise in the number of people who are looking for managed service help, or one-off help, some training, some mentoring, trying to be that kind of spirit guide or the guru to the existing staff that they have. So you're seeing kind of a combination of things. There isn't one solution to fit all. A lot of it depends on how wide and deep you're trying to get with the technology, and where you're going. Now, on the development side of the open source house, honestly, we're much better off than we are in the database space, because colleges, universities, boot camps for coders, all of them are not focused on proprietary tools. They're all focused on the open source space. So you're seeing that adoption move very, very fast there. And so it's easier on the development side to find, the people who actually know the technology stack and, want to use it. Read an interesting stat. I don't remember where it was, but I think it was something like 70%. And, I don't know if this is the exact number, but it was like 70% of, college age graduates are using the stack that they're going to develop in as one of the key drivers for what position they choose. Right. So,
wow.
So yeah. I remember reading that from some business magazine. And so if that's the case, then that is a powerful, indication that people are really, really passionate about what stack is cool and interesting and what's going to, help, them advance in their career, what's going to scratch their niche.
Yeah. Okay. That's really interesting. And I think, so we sort of got to wait then, I guess, for these students to come out and the people who've been in the code camps till we have a huge influx of experts looking after it. But I definitely know that's something that Open Teams that works on too, is an idea of a placement program whereby you take someone in, you upskill them and you get them ready. And I think this would be something that's definitely going to be in demand very, very soon. And if not now, like obviously you're saying, it's already a big problem.
Well, and what's interesting is there's so many open source projects out there, right? So, for MySQL, for instance, if you go out to GitHub and look at MySQL, there's over 100,000 MySQL projects. There's 2,000 different ways to do high availability on GitHub, right? So, like, there's so many. Finding the right expert for the right thing, even when you have, college kids and college graduates and people going through coder camps, learning how to code in Python or Ruby. The frameworks and the libraries and the integration pieces are so critical. Having an expert who can come in and help you with those is really, really critical.
Yeah, I think that's also just not really to talk about it too much, but in Open Teams, that's definitely our thesis that we're building upon, is this idea that open source really is a long tail of open source projects. The Red Hats, the IBMs, they're helping to provide support and training and everything you need around these popular large open source projects. But like you said, there's hundreds of thousands of other projects out there which companies are building their critical software infrastructure on. But it's quite hard to find these companies, and it's quite hard to find a certain different company for every single different project. So that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to make it easy to find, vet, and contract with those service providers.
Yeah, no, and I mean, here's the thing: the bigger the enterprise and the more established, the enterprise, and really even like the small to medium sized businesses now that have mission critical open source applications, they're looking for a stack that will work together and they can get support and help on, right? While we've found that, from the database space, 66% of DBAs prefer to self-support. Okay. That means a third of the industry need help or want help.
Wow. Okay.
Right. And so, that self-support, that's where, for us, a lot of those people come in and they look for us for consulting help, right? A one-off, I have this thing that I can't solve. Right, because even the smartest people in the world can't solve everything. Right, somebody needs to be a doctor to a doctor. Right, exactly. But there's a third of the $100 billion open source industry that still wants and needs that support and has a willingness to pay for it. They want those things to work together, and the other 66% really kind of sway and move when they have issues and when problems come up. And that's what really drives them is, they reach the limits of what they can handle. And a lot of times what you'll find in these open source, stacks is things work really, really well until they don't, right? Exactly. Hey, at 10,000 users, we're golden. Yeah. 10,000 users, we're golden. 100,000, we're not. But at 10,000, everything's working great. I don't need any help. At 100,000, we're like, oh my God, this is crazy.
Yeah. Okay. And I know just on the idea, touch of that survey, where I assume that's where you just pulled that statistic from, was the recent survey that Percona released called the Open Source Data Management Software Survey. I'll actually leave a link in the description for everyone who's listening or watching. But one interesting fact, and I think it probably relates to the same statistic you just used, but that is that most companies, or a majority of companies, have never really paid for open source. So they've never purchased a freemium license. They've never purchased a support contract. So why is that? Is that changing? Or
well, so one of the great things about open source is you don't have to pay, right? And
exactly.
so with people, they want to start with limited lock-in. So one of the reasons that we found when we in our survey was that people moved to open source databases. And we asked why, right? And so 69% said to avoid vendor lock-in. Right? They don't want to be locked in.
Yep.
Right. Oracle is the epitome of lock-in for a lot of us old school DBAs who have been around the block a few times. Right. So they don't want that lock-in. And so, when you have, that kind of idea that I'm paying and I'm stuck paying these folks, that drives people to say open source in a lot of people's minds is free. And it can be free if you don't need the features, or you don't need, the open core version or the enterprise version of some of these, or you don't need the support and the services and the help to maintain it. And, if you think about how open source really started, open source caused and was really what built the internet as it is today, right? So back when I started in my internet service provider days, and I was the Oracle DBA, right? Oracle licenses was like $1 million, right?
Yeah.
So imagine if Mark Zuckerberg over at Facebook was, building Facebook, and his only choice for a database was Oracle. He wouldn't have $1 million as a Harvard, kid to go out there and buy an Oracle license, right? It wouldn't work, right? Right. So by having access to Apache and PHP and Perl and Python and all these different technologies, you've enabled everything that we love about the internet today, right? This is where this grew. Now, unfortunately, what we're seeing happen is that is great for the community, but it does limit your capabilities as a publicly traded company, or a company that is very focused on shareholder value, to continue to grow your business, because you grow a very steady or a slower pace. So you've got to find, the quote unquote stickiness, if you will, in your, offerings. And so for a long time, that stickiness was through open core software, with the idea that you produce an enterprise version and you put things in the enterprise version like backup. Oh, you want to back up your database? You're going to have to pay for that, right? Yep. You can back it up with it shut down, but you can't back it up, hot. And so, who wants that? But you start to find, these features that people look for, and the product teams look for these killer features that are going to cause people to buy, their software, increase your shareholder value, and create the stickiness within the subscription to keep you, coming back, right? MongoDB's, financial statements are really great to read. They're really interesting because they really pride themselves. There's this line in there that I love, that every quarter, for 15 or 16 quarters now, they've had 120 or 125% net retention, which means that their business model is predicated on taking what is currently available and growing it 25% quarter over quarter over quarter. How do they do that? Right? Yeah. They get you to buy more. They get you to spend more money, right? And so we've started to see not only that, open core, but that's moved into the, the cloud space, and, the new licenses that have occurred. And so now we've got, the cloud providers coming out, and they're saying, hey, you can run on our platform here, spend a premium to run your database, spend a premium to run your software on our platform. And, you'll just pay us instead of paying your vendor, and you can avoid the lock-in with the vendor. Well, the database vendors don't like that, because it's competing with them. But you're getting locked into these not quite open source databases that are on the cloud providers. And that's taking away business from the database vendors. So the database vendors have started to change their licensing. And now we've got database vendors competing with cloud vendors in this, totally frenemy relationship, because, their software runs on one another and they require one another in order to be successful. But we're going to change our licensing and our structures and prevent you from doing things that are going to, steal our business, because we need to protect our shareholder value. And so that evolution has been happening for the last few years. And unfortunately, I think it's hurting, the consumers and the users, quite a bit, because it limits, the innovation, and it, stifles some of what we've seen grow the community in the past.
Okay, and what do you think? What do we need to do today to make sure that we can work towards a better future, and we don't? Because I think definitely something I've observed and read quite a bit about is the idea that these open core models and similar models have started off with, say, gating a lot of features. So saying, hey, you have to pay for a lot of features. But as competition has grown, they've kind of reduced the amount of features that they can charge for because of the competition. So is that something you've observed? Actually,
now what we're seeing is not only so the features still are gated, but what we're seeing is that the features are now being reserved for their as a service offerings. So if you run in their cloud, you'll get the features.
Okay.
And not necessarily in the downloaded enterprise version. So it's a bit of a shell game there, because they want you to move to the consumption model, because this consumption model right now is really, it's scale by credit card, right? So you can scale as much as you want as long as your credit card's good.
Right?
Swipe. Yes, and that's where it's interesting to see. You want to push people to to that model, and so to answer the second question first. Yes, we are seeing some more, features not showing up in the enterprise versions, more features trying to drive adoption of the software in the free version because of the competition. But we're seeing that offset by people trying to drive them to their database as a service. So now, the model for most people is, let's get them hooked on the free version and then get them over to the database as a service version, because once they're in the database as a service version, we can get all kinds of information on what they're doing, but we can also understand intimate details, and it increases the stickiness. Remember that I said the stickiness? It increases the stickiness of that particular product. And so that's great, for them. Not so great for consumers if you don't know what you're doing, because you're going to pay by that credit card. But how do we avoid that? That's a tough one, right? And so one of the things that Percona really prides ourselves on is we're trying to keep open source open, right? Especially around the databases. That's our goal. Our goal is to really keep open source open. We want to take the features and the things that the community needs and provide them for free, right? That's our goal. We want you to have everything you need to be successful in running your own database for free. Now, if you need our help and our expertise to help accelerate, moving you to, do what you need faster. If you don't have the expertise to do it, we have services, we have subscriptions that will help you. We'll have components that will help you do that quicker, faster. But we do not believe that anyone should be prevented from running, enterprise class software by locked in features. And they shouldn't be hidden behind a paywall. They shouldn't lock you in, to some, crazy, complicated contract. And so that's where all of the work that we're doing is focused on that. But as we start to evolve, and as we start to look at, how to prevent this, from a widespread community perspective, it really takes the users, the developers, it takes the contributors to these projects, right? Contributing them to the open source space, making sure that they have, sane open licenses that people can use and adopt. That's really important, right? The more restrictive the license, the less likely it is going to be picked up and evolved and, move forward.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's probably a good segue just to touch on Percona and what the company is. So just for those listening, what is Percona? What do you do? What are your main activities?
So Percona is 14 years old. We focus on making open source databases more accessible and better for everyone in the world, right? Our goal, like I said, is to keep open source databases open. That's what we do. And how we do that is we give people, free educational materials. Our blog right now has hundreds of thousands of readers every month. You can, go to our blog and find out how to, tune your database, optimize it, back it up, set up HA, make sure you get the most out of, AWS. Everything's free. It's ungated. Just go there, find any, a lot of solutions to a lot of the common problems that exist. right? And so we believe in that education, that free, material, trying to get people to do better with what is already out there. Mm-hmm. And our philosophy is, if you need us, if we're good, if you buy into what we can offer for free, then you should come to us and use us for services, help you get better, right? Get 2-3 times the value that you normally get just by running it yourself. And so our philosophy has always been focus on helping customers, focus on helping users, make them successful. And then, we'll work with you as you need to work with us, as you have needs to make you more successful with our services. And so we'll help people, with, one-off problems with their databases through our consulting services. We have support services as your spirit guru. Call us 24/7, right? Pick up the phone and be like, oh my God, my database crashed. I need some help. And we'll be right there. Or, if you just want to turn it over to us, we have our own managed service department where we just manage people's, databases for them around the clock. And, we handle problems before they come problems. And we also, take that and we build our own enhanced versions of MySQL, Mongo, Postgres to include all of those lock-in features that enterprise, versions have for MySQL Enterprise or Mongo Enterprise or, some of the bigger, Postgres vendors, and we put them in the free space, right? So we unlock them. We unlock the software, right? So, imagine that. Get the enterprise version for free. Because again, we believe that you shouldn't be locked in to get value from open source.
Okay, I think that's great. And it's definitely, I think, a unique perspective that a lot of these profit-driven companies, or at least compared to those profit-driven companies. So I think that's really inspiring to hear that. I'd now like to shift gears a little bit and focus on, asking a few questions about things that I think companies will definitely find useful, given your experience and given that they need help managing their open source technologies or would like to improve the way they manage their open source technologies. So I'll start off, by asking, what are some of the key trends that you think the company should be aware of in the coming decade as it relates to open source?
So I think there's a few things, right? So number one, you don't have to look far, and this isn't so far future looking that you can't see the impact that cloud native development has had on the overall tech ecosystem, right? The evolution of microservices, the evolution of this cloud native design has made it so you can rapidly prototype, rapidly deploy, massive amounts of applications in short amount of time. Right. Mm-hmm. And what that means is instead of, spending a lot of time developing individual components, you can reuse things, you can, definitely take what you've got and scale it, much further. But it means that what we're entering is a time when we've got more and more complexity than we've ever had anywhere before. Right. So again, we go back to our, talk about the open source survey that Percona put together. Right. We see that the number of people who have been growing, the number of databases that they have to control is massive. Right. So the number of people who reported 1,000 databases grew 50% year over year. Okay. 1,000 databases. Okay. Now just imagine, right, that as a professional who has to maintain said databases, that's a lot,
Headache.
right?
Headache.
And so, the larger the complexity, the more you're going to see, the need for the proper tooling, the need for the proper, infrastructure, the need for the proper observability features, and the tuning capabilities, right? And we see this also with not only with the number of, things that we're trying to do, the number of technologies. Okay, so we've seen a technology explosion happen. Mm-hmm. So when you look at, when you again use the database space, which I'm infinitely familiar with, right now more than 92% of companies are running more than one database in their, a data center.
Wow.
Right. Okay. So they have like MySQL and Postgres and Mongo and they're running like 7-8 different databases. Right. So they have all these different technologies, right? And you see that also with technology stacks that are like development stacks. you don't have generally just a Python shop anymore. You might have Python and Ruby and PHP and Rust and this, that's the other thing, all kind of like in the same space.
Yep.
And why is that? Because we're shifting a demographic shift where we're now pushing responsibility for a lot of the application design into individual development teams and individual contributors' hands. And so we're letting people decide the stacks and be free to develop quickly because we want a higher, faster return on our investment, right? How can we enable this team? We've hired this Ruby expert, or Ruby's old. I shouldn't use Ruby. That's a horrible thing. A Go expert. That dates me, right? We hire a Go expert, and we don't know Go, but he's a Go expert, and he's going to go fast, right? That's what Go means. Go fast. So let's let him do it. Even though we're a Python shop. So now we've got Go over here. And he knows Postgres, but the other guys, they know MySQL. So we'll just add this. And so what we're seeing is the teams that have to maintain these, I call it the great technology inheritance problem, because now all of a sudden they're inheriting all this technology and they don't know how to handle it. They don't know. Now I've got thousands of databases. I've got hundreds of different permutations of application stacks. I've got all this different infrastructure. I've got multiple cloud providers. How am I going to handle this? Right. And it causes schizophrenia because you've got so much going on. So what are you going to do? How are you going to handle it? And that problem is probably the biggest problem that I worry about going forward is as this evolves, we have this need, this unshakable need, this need to grow and to continue to consume and to add new technologies, new resources. And that's not going to change. Right. You think about everybody's, hot to trot on machine learning and AI and all this. All that requires data. All that data needs to be stored somewhere. And does anybody want to get rid of it? No, they never want to get rid of it. That means more data. That means more systems. That means more and more and more and more.
Okay, that's amazing. I think that was such a great response. And I definitely agree. It falls in line with the next question I want to ask. But on the other end of the spectrum is, I guess, some of the benefits of using open source. And I know that we touched on it briefly before, the idea of vendor lock-in. That's one of the benefits. Also, other companies obviously found that it's free or it's at least cheaper than commercial software and often works better. But what are some of the benefits that aren't so obvious to people or to companies?
Well, so I mentioned before that there's an issue with the technology, gap in the understanding on the database side. The application side, it is much easier today to find application people than it was, 10 years ago, right? So developers, right, who can, code in, Python, right? I mean, hey, 5 years ago, Python, that was a tough skill to find, but you're seeing it more and more. So, as open source gets adopted, it is easier to find some of those development skills, some of those, things to help develop your applications. But one of the big things that I've seen that is a big benefit to the open source space and to the open source, growth is really understanding, that this is a technology that anyone can start with, anyone can, use, anyone can get their hands around. And so it's that freedom, it's that openness, it's the, distribution, if you will, of it across the organization or across the world, and really not the organization, just across the world. Anybody can start their project and be successful with something that, the biggest companies in the world use.
Reduces barriers completely. Yeah.
It reduces barriers. The barrier to entry has massively shrunk, right?
Yeah.
So now, it used to be, average Joe couldn't do this. Average Joe has access to this, which is a blessing and a curse. Right. Yeah. And I mean, honestly, this is one of the reasons why a lot of, security issues have happened. Right. Yeah. So, I don't know if you follow security issues. It's kind of like this thing that I've tweeted a lot about these. Every time I see them, I like to retweet, some of these things because they're really weird. We see people who don't know how to and don't understand the technology start to deploy technology. Right. I'm going to throw out a MongoDB instance. I'm going to throw out an Elastic instance. I'm going to put some data out there and I'm going to analyze my data. I'm going to make sure I can see what's coming out of that, right? I'm going to do better. And so they'll start it up and not realize, maybe I should have set a password. Oops, forgot to set a password. Again, that barrier of entry has come down so far. They can do that without understanding those technical bops, those technical details. And then all of a sudden they run into problems. And then, here I am with my data hacked 3 times, or 30 times actually. I have more free credit monitoring offers than I could ever consume in a lifetime. My daughter has her inheritance set for free lifetime credit monitoring for her kids and their grandkids, just because I've been hacked so much. But that's all because that barrier of entry, reduced so much. So there's this double-edged sword. It's awesome that anybody can jump in, but then there's this dark downside where all of a sudden, the Spider-Man quote, with great power comes great responsibility. It's totally true. So, if I can give one advice to everybody out there, if you are going to deploy a database, please set a password. Please.
Number one thing to do, just set the password.
Yes, set a password. But with that, I can personally, if that's my crusade, if I can get everyone to set a password, I can reduce the number of data breaches by 50% next year. Just by
really?
that one thing. Yes, it's that high. Yes.
Oh my goodness.
Yes.
Wow.
One line of code. Set password.
Then almost needs to just be a pop-up alert whenever someone sets up a database. Have you forgotten the password? Have you put the password in?
Yes.
It seems so trivial, but
yes,
I guess down the road it has very bad consequences.
Right. But one of the other benefits that I didn't mention, and I will, is one of the other kind of really fun and interesting things that I like, because like I said, I come from a tech background, is with open source, you do have the observability and the visibility into the software itself and what it's doing. And that is something that I cannot understate how important it is as you scale and grow a company, right? When you look at, the Silicon Valley unicorns, they've all done things to modify or enhance the open source software they use by finding the bottlenecks and the limitations that exist in the software that are relevant to them. And that has enabled them to move in ways that no one could ever have predicted, right? Yeah. And so you see open source projects and new, features and libraries pop up all the time, right? I don't know if you're familiar with Vitess. Are you familiar with Vitess? PlanetScale is a company that is in the MySQL ecosystem, and they've built the enterprise version of Vitess. But Vitess was an example of that. YouTube created Vitess early on to scale MySQL. They found that their use case for MySQL was so limited that they needed something to build, to handle the scalability. So they were able to look in the code, see the issues. They were able to build a framework on top of MySQL to enable massive scale out. And that type of thing can't be done with some of these other applications that are closed source and proprietary.
Yeah. Definitely. No, that's fascinating. I definitely do agree. They get a lift under the hood, but they also, and you see so many companies now hiring open source contributors so that their needs can be met in that open source software. So I couldn't agree more with that benefit. But I thought we'd finish off the final question I'd like to ask. You seem like an extremely optimistic person. So what are you most excited about when you think about the future of open source software?
Ooh, what am I most excited about? Well, I think that I am most excited that, as the open source ecosystem continues to grow, I want to see what we can do next, right? I think that the next generation of developers who are coming up, the next generation of people are going to develop things that we could never fathom, never imagine, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the great thing about open source is you continually get surprised, right? Yeah. And so I want to see the stuff that I don't know about. I want to see someone come to the stage with a passion about something new. And I want to get shocked. I want to get surprised. I want to get inspired. Mm-hmm. And that's the thing. Every year, every month, every time that there's a new open source conference, every time there's some new open source software released, you have that capability to just be dazzled. And I want to see what's next. And I think that, as we continue to grow, as we continue to scale, as we continue to see adoption across the board, that's getting more and more likely every day that you're going to see the next big thing, the next wave, right? Yeah. And that's just so inspiring. It's so, awe-inspiring that it's just great.
Awesome. I think definitely in the age of 2020, we need that positivity. We need something that inspires us to get us through. But Matt, thank you so much for joining us today. It has been an absolute pleasure. I've loved chatting with you and getting to know you. And hopefully we'll have you on back sometime.
All right. I appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, you, Matt. So for those listening, if you liked what you listened or watched today, if you're watching on YouTube, then please leave a review and let us know what you think. It really, really does help out. If you like the video on YouTube, please subscribe to see more content like this and to stay up to date. But anyway, thank you very much for listening and stay safe, everyone. Till next time. See you later.